I did not remember the moment I died in the way people expect, with some grand cinematic clarity or a final sentence that carried meaning. Because what I remember instead was paperwork, the dry scrape of a pen against something that felt like skin but looked like paper, and a voice that sounded like it had been dragged across gravel, asking me if I preferred front of house or back, as if I had simply walked into a job interview instead of whatever came after a life I had already failed to live correctly. The building stood before me like something out of a luxury magazine, with gold-trimmed glass doors reflecting a version of me that looked cleaner than I deserved, and a sign above it written in elegant lettering that read, "The Last Supper Club," which would have been funny if I had still been capable of laughing in a way that meant anything. Inside, however, the illusion collapsed the moment the doors closed behind me, because the smell hit first, thick and wet and wrong, like meat that had learned how to rot without ever stopping being alive. And the marble floors I had admired from the outside were cracked open in veins that pulsed faintly, as if the building itself was breathing in slow, deliberate cycles. "Welcome to your shift," the voice said again, closer now, and when I turned, I saw the devil not as some horned caricature, but as a chef, dressed in immaculate white that somehow stayed unstained despite the filth around him, his face too symmetrical to trust and his smile too calm to be kind. "You'll be serving," he continued, gesturing toward a dining room filled with figures who sat too still or moved too erratically, each one locked in some private version of eternity that had been plated and presented like a meal they could not refuse. I opened my mouth to ask a question, something simple like how long, but he spoke over me with a tone that suggested the answer would not matter anyway. "Forever is a long time," he said, almost pleasantly, "but you'll find it fills itself if you keep busy." That was how my job started, not with flames or punishment, but with a uniform that fit perfectly and a tray that felt heavier than it should have, as if every plate carried something more than food, something that pressed into my hands and up through my arms until I understood, without being told, that this was not service in the way I had known it before. This was accounting, and I had debts. The work settled into a rhythm faster than I expected, because the body adapts even when the soul resists. And soon enough, I found myself moving through the dining room with a kind of mechanical precision that made it easier not to think too hard about what I was actually doing. Step, turn, balance the tray. Do not look too long at the customers. Do not listen too closely to what they say when they think you are not paying attention. Table numbers did not follow logic, because table 3 could be beside table 89, and table 12 might appear only when you blinked, but the system still existed, buried somewhere beneath the chaos, and I learned to feel it rather than understand it. "Order up," the devil would call from the kitchen, his voice cutting through the low murmur of suffering conversations, and I would move before I consciously decided to, because hesitation had consequences that I learned about the hard way. The plates were always warm, sometimes hot enough to burn, but I stopped reacting after the first few shifts because pain here did not fade so much as it layered, becoming part of the background noise of existence. Each dish looked exquisite at first glance, arranged with the kind of care you would expect from a Michelin-starred restaurant. But if you focused too long, the details shifted, revealing textures that did not belong, colors that pulsed faintly, and garnishes that seemed to move when you weren't directly watching them. "Serve from the left," I muttered to myself, repeating instructions that had been given without explanation, because consistency was the only thing that kept the place from unraveling completely. "Clear from the right. Never spill. Never drop." The customers, if that was even the right word for them, varied in ways that made it difficult to categorize them, because some looked almost normal, dressed in clothes that suggested lives interrupted mid-routine, while others were altered, their forms stretched or compressed or fractured in ways that reflected something deeper than physical damage. One man sat at the same table every shift, his suit perfectly pressed despite the blood that seeped continuously from the seams, and every time I approached, He would look up with the same polite smile and say, "I didn't order this," even though I knew he had, because I had taken the order myself. "You did," I would reply, keeping my voice steady because arguing never helped. "Ah," he would say, nodding as if that made sense, before cutting into the dish with a fork that sank too easily into something that should not have been so soft. Tips were left in strange ways, sometimes as coins that felt too cold to hold, sometimes as folded bills that whispered when you touched them, and sometimes as things that were not currency at all but still counted because the total mattered more than the form. I did not know the target yet, not in numbers, but I could feel it, like a weight hanging somewhere just out of reach, pulling at me with a quiet, persistent insistence. And above it all, the devil watched, his expression never changing, his hands always moving, preparing the next dish, the next course, the next piece of whatever this place was designed to be. The anomalies did not start as anything dramatic because nothing in this place ever announced itself with clarity, and instead they crept in slowly, like a draft you only notice after you've been cold for a while. It began with the bell. At first I thought it was part of the kitchen rhythm, a signal that orders were ready because it rang once, sharp and clean, and every server, there were others though we rarely spoke, would instinctively turn toward the source. But then, one shift, as I was clearing a table where the plates had begun to fuse with the surface, I heard it ring again. 2 distinct chimes, close together. The sound cut through everything, through the murmurs and the clatter and the low, constant hum of something alive beneath the floor, and for a moment, everything stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The customers froze mid-motion, forks suspended in the air, expressions locked in place, and even the devil paused, his knife hovering above a piece of meat that pulsed once, twice, and then went still. I felt it then, a pressure behind my eyes, like something trying to push its way out, or something else trying to push its way in. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the sudden silence. No one answered. No one moved. And then, just as suddenly, everything resumed, as if the interruption had been edited out of reality itself, leaving only the memory behind as proof that it had ever happened. I approached the nearest server, a woman whose face I could never quite remember, and I leaned in close, lowering my voice. "Did the bell ring twice?" I whispered, the words feeling heavier than they should have. She did not look at me. She did not react. She simply continued walking, her tray perfectly balanced, her steps perfectly measured, as if I had not spoken at all. That was the first time I understood that there were things here I was not supposed to notice, and that noticing them was a problem. The list of rules was not given to me directly, not in the way you would expect from a job that relied so heavily on obedience, but instead it appeared during a moment when the restaurant felt thinner, as if the layers of reality that held it together had shifted just enough to expose what lay beneath. I found it in the staff hallway, a place that should not have existed based on the layout I had memorized, where the walls were lined with something that looked like wallpaper but pulsed faintly when touched, and the air carried a low hum that resonated in my bones. Pinned to the wall was a sheet of paper, except it was not paper, it was skin, stretched flat and nailed at the corners, and written across it in neat, deliberate handwriting were the rules. 1. The bell must not ring twice. 2. If the customer asks if this is hell, just smile and take their order. 3. Do not take the seraphim's order. 4. Work 24/7, no breaks. 5. Collect a total of $1 million tip to go to heaven. My eyes lingered on the first line because I had already heard it happen, already felt the way the world had paused around it, and a cold realization settled into me like something sinking into deep water. I was already in violation, or at least I had witnessed one, and that meant something. I did not know what yet, but in a place like this, everything meant something. The next time the bell rang, I was ready for it. Or at least I told myself I was, because preparation is a fragile illusion in a place where the rules exist to be broken in ways you cannot predict. The first chime came as expected, sharp and clean, cutting through the noise of the dining room and signaling another round of service, and I moved toward the kitchen with the same practiced efficiency I had developed over countless shifts. But then, as I reached for the tray, it happened again. The second chime, closer this time, louder. And instead of freezing, the world seemed to stretch, the space between moments elongating in a way that made every movement feel delayed, like I was watching everything through thick glass. The devil looked at me, not at the room, not at the food, at me. His smile widened just slightly, enough to reveal something behind it that had not been there before. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice calm, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather instead of something that had just disrupted the fabric of whatever this place was. I swallowed, the motion feeling exaggerated in the stretched time. "I heard it," I said, choosing my words carefully because instinct told me that this was a test, even if I did not understand the criteria. "And?" he prompted, tilting his head in a way that suggested curiosity but not kindness. I glanced toward the dining room where the customers had not frozen this time, but instead had begun to move in slow, distorted ways, their gestures looping slightly, their expressions flickering between states as if they were being rendered incorrectly. "The bell," I said slowly, "only rang once." For a moment nothing happened, and then the stretch snapped back into place, reality contracting around me with a force that made my ears ring, and the world resumed its normal, broken rhythm. The devil's smile returned to its previous shape, smooth and unreadable. "Good," he said simply, before turning back to his work as if the moment had never occurred. But I knew what the rule meant now. It was not about the bell. It was about acknowledgement. And in this place, acknowledging the wrong thing could cost you more than you had left to give. That night, or what passed for night because time did not behave normally here, I stood in the hallway again, staring at the list, my fingers hovering just above the surface of the skin it was written on, afraid to touch it but unable to walk away. "I heard it," I murmured, my voice barely more than a breath, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention from something that was always listening. And I lied. The words felt heavy, but not wrong, because survival here was not about truth, but about alignment, about understanding which version of reality you were expected to uphold at any given moment. I looked back at the first rule, the letters seeming to shift slightly as I focused on them, as if they were not fixed but alive, adapting to something I could not see. The bell must not ring twice. Must not. A command, and yet I had heard it, which meant either the rule was being broken or something wanted me to think it was. I stepped back slowly, the hum in the walls growing louder, resonating through my chest like a second heartbeat, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt something close to fear that was not just background noise. Because if the rules could be bent, then so could everything else. And in a place like this, that was not freedom. That was danger. I used to believe in rules, back when I wore a badge instead of a uniform stained with things I refused to identify. I believed that rules were the line between order and chaos, between right and wrong, between the people who deserved saving and the ones who didn't. But standing there, in a hallway that should not exist, staring at a list written on something that used to be alive, I began to understand that rules are only as meaningful as the ones enforcing them. And here, the one enforcing them was the devil, which meant the rules were not about justice, they were about balance. And I was part of the system now, whether I wanted to be or not. The second rule did not announce itself with the same kind of distortion as the first, because there was no bell, no rupture in the fabric of the room, no pause that let you understand something had gone wrong. And instead it slipped into the rhythm of service so cleanly that I almost missed it entirely. Which in hindsight felt intentional, because the most dangerous rules are the ones that look like normal conversation. It happened at table 17, which had not been there at the start of the shift, but existed now as if it always had, tucked between a couple that argued in whispers sharp enough to cut, and a man who ate with mechanical precision, chewing each bite exactly 23 times before swallowing. The customer at table 17 looked new. Not altered, not warped, just new. His clothes were still crisp. His posture still carried the stiffness of someone who had not yet realized they would never leave, and his eyes moved constantly, scanning the room with a kind of desperate logic that tried to make sense of things that were not meant to be understood. I approached with my usual pace, tray balanced, expression neutral, because anything else drew attention, and attention in this place had weight. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady despite the way his gaze snapped toward me, locking onto my face as if I were the only stable object in a collapsing world. "Yeah," he replied, his voice uneven, carrying that tremor I had heard before in others who had just arrived. "Yeah, hi, I don't understand what this place is." I did not answer. I waited, because part of the job was knowing when silence was safer than speech. He swallowed, his throat working visibly, and then he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if he were afraid of being overheard, which, in a way, he should have been. "Is this?" He hesitated, the words catching on something internal, something that resisted being spoken aloud. "Is this hell?" The question hung between us, heavy and fragile at the same time, and in that moment I felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself had leaned in to listen. If the customer asks if this is hell, just smile and take their order. The rule surfaced in my mind with a clarity that cut through everything else, the words aligning with the situation so perfectly that it felt less like remembering and more like being guided. So I smiled, not warmly, not kindly, just enough to satisfy the shape of the instruction. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" I asked, my tone smooth, practiced, as if he had asked about the weather instead of the nature of his existence. His expression shifted, confusion deepening into something sharper, something closer to panic, because he knew on some level that his question had not been answered. "That's not what he began, his voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of the tables around him. "I recommend the house red," I interrupted gently, maintaining the smile, because the rule did not allow for deviation, not even in tone. "It's very popular." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face for something, recognition, empathy, truth, and finding none of it, because none of it was permitted. "Fine," he said finally, the word collapsing under its own weight. "Yeah, fine, just bring me that." "Of course," I replied, inclining my head slightly before turning away, the smile fading the moment my back was to him, because holding it any longer felt like it would crack something inside me that I could not afford to lose. As I walked toward the kitchen, I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unresolved, and I knew, without needing to look back, that the question would stay with him, looping endlessly. Because here, answers were not given, they were avoided, and that avoidance, that was part of the punishment. The work did not stop because it never stopped, and soon enough I found myself moving from table to table, repeating the same patterns, the same motions, the same carefully constructed interactions that kept everything running just smoothly enough to prevent collapse. Orders, deliver, clear, and reset. The rhythm became a kind of anchor, something I could hold on to when the edges of the place started to blur, when the walls seemed to breathe a little too deeply, when the customers' voices layered over each other in ways that made it difficult to separate one conversation from another. "Order up," the devil called again, his tone unchanged, his movements precise as he plated something that looked like a perfectly seared cut of meat until it twitched slightly under the garnish. I stepped forward, taking the tray, the weight settling into my hands like something familiar, something inevitable. "You're adapting," he said, not looking at me, his attention focused entirely on the next dish. "That's good." I did not respond, because I had learned that his statements were not invitations for conversation, but observations, markers in a process I did not fully understand. "Most don't," he continued, almost idly as if discussing a minor inconvenience. They break. I tightened my grip on the tray, the edge pressing into my palm. "I won't," I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out with a conviction I was not entirely sure I felt. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, and then he smiled again. "They all say that," he replied softly, before gesturing toward the dining room. "Table 17 is waiting." When I returned to table 17, the man had not touched his drink, which sat untouched in front of him, the surface of the liquid perfectly still despite the subtle vibrations that ran through the rest of the room. "You didn't answer me," he said immediately, his voice lower now, more controlled, but no less intense. "I ordered," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, "and I brought your drink." "That's not what I meant," he snapped, the edge in his voice drawing glances from nearby tables where conversation slowed just enough to acknowledge the disruption. "I asked you something." I held his gaze, the rule echoing in my mind, steady and unyielding. "And I'm here to take your order," I said, the words landing with a finality that seemed to deflate something in him. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, might push further, might try to force the answer out of me through sheer insistence, but then his shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him in a way that felt familiar, like I had seen it before, like I had caused it before. "Just bring me whatever," he muttered, looking down at the table, avoiding my eyes. "Anything." "Of course," I replied, writing nothing down because the order did not matter. It never did. The hours stretched, or maybe they folded. Time here did not move in a straight line, and trying to measure it only made it feel heavier, more oppressive, like something pressing down from above. My feet ached, but the ache never escalated into pain that demanded rest, because rest was not part of the system, and exhaustion here was designed to sustain itself without resolution. I moved faster, then slower, then faster again, carrying trays that seemed to grow heavier with each pass, as if the weight of what I was doing accumulated in ways that were not strictly physical. At one point, I caught my reflection in a polished surface, something that might have been a mirror once, and for a split second, I did not recognize the person looking back. The uniform was the same, the posture was the same, but the eyes looked older. Not in years, in something else. Something that had nothing to do with time. I found myself back in the hallway again, drawn there by something I could not quite name, something that felt like a need to confirm that the rules still existed, that they had not changed in my absence. "They're real," I murmured, tracing the edge of the second line without touching it, the letters seeming to shift slightly under my gaze. "If the customer asks if this is hell, just smile and take their order." "I followed it," I whispered, the words carrying a strange mix of relief and unease. "And it worked." But even as I said it, I knew that "worked" was not the right word, because nothing here worked in the way things were supposed to, and success was measured not in outcomes, but in survival. I stepped back, the hum in the walls rising slightly as if acknowledging my presence, and for a moment I considered what would happen if I broke the rule, if I answered the question, if I told the truth. The thought lingered, tempting and dangerous, because part of me, the part that still remembered who I had been, wanted to do it, wanted to offer some kind of honesty in a place built on avoidance. But another part, the part that had adapted, that had learned the rhythm, understood that rules here were not suggestions, they were boundaries, and crossing them had consequences. I used to answer questions for a living. People would come to me with confusion, with fear, with situations they did not understand, and I would give them clarity, or at least the closest thing to it that I could manage, because that was the job, that was the point. But here, clarity was not part of the service. Here, the job was to maintain the illusion, to keep the system running, to ensure that the customers remained engaged in whatever version of their punishment had been prepared for them. And I was part of that now, not an observer, not an outsider, a participant, which meant that every time I smiled instead of answering, every time I redirected instead of explaining, I was contributing to something I did not fully understand but could feel in the way it settled into me, layer by layer, like sediment. I did not know how many layers I could carry before something gave out. I did not know if I would notice when it happened. But I knew, with a certainty that felt heavier than anything I had carried so far, that I was changing, and not in a way that led anywhere good. The third rule did not come to me through memory alone, because unlike the others, it required something to appear, something that did not belong to the usual rotation of customers or patterns of service, and when it finally revealed itself, it did so with a kind of quiet authority that made everything else in the room feel like background noise. It began with a table that was not there. Not in the way Table 17 had appeared, slipping into place between existing structures, but in a way that suggested it had always been present, hidden just outside the range of perception until something shifted enough for it to be seen. I noticed it while carrying a tray past what should have been an empty stretch of floor, where the spacing between tables had always allowed for a clean path, and suddenly, without warning, there it was. A single table, perfectly set, untouched by the grime that infected everything else in the restaurant. The cloth was white, not off-white, not stained, white in a way that hurt to look at, because it did not belong here. And seated at that table was a figure that did not move, did not breathe, did not fidget or twitch or loop like the others. It simply existed. I slowed my steps without meaning to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, because something about that table felt wrong in a way that was different from everything else. Not corrupted or broken, but precise, too precise. As I drew closer, the details sharpened, and I saw that the figure was dressed in something that resembled robes, layered and flowing, each fold falling in perfect symmetry, untouched by the subtle distortions that affected every other surface in the room. Its face, I hesitate to call it a face because it was less a collection of features and more an arrangement of light, soft and steady, obscuring whatever lay beneath in a way that made it impossible to focus on any one point. And yet, I knew it was looking at me. Not in the way the others looked, with desperation or confusion or hunger, but with awareness, recognition, as if it had been waiting. I became aware, slowly, of the rest of the room, not through sight, through absence. The usual noise, the clatter, the murmurs, the subtle hum of the walls had faded, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate, contained, as if everything outside this moment had been temporarily set aside. I glanced around, my movements careful, controlled, and saw that the other servers were still moving, still working, but their actions were muted, their forms slightly blurred at the edges, as if they existed on a different layer of reality. The customers, too, continued their endless routines, but their movements no longer carried weight, no longer drew attention. Everything had narrowed, focused on this table, on this figure, on me. "You should leave," the voice said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "This interaction is not permitted." The rule echoed again in my mind, aligning perfectly with the instruction. Do not take the seraphim's order. I took a step back, the motion feeling like it required effort against an unseen resistance, like walking away from something that exerted a pull not on the body, but on the mind. "I understand," I said, though I was not sure that I did, not fully. "Good," the voice replied, and for a moment I felt something brush against the edges of my thoughts. Not invasive, but present, like a hand hovering just above the surface of water. "Then go." Turning away was harder than it should have been. Not physically, but in a way that made each step feel like it was being measured, evaluated, as if something was watching to see if I would hesitate, if I would look back, if I would break the boundary that had been drawn. I did not. I kept my gaze forward, my movements steady, forcing myself back into the rhythm of the floor, picking up the nearest task, the nearest table, the nearest action that fit within the established patterns. But the rhythm felt off now, slightly misaligned, like a song played just out of tune, because I could still feel it, that presence, that awareness, lingering at the edge of my perception. And I knew, without needing to confirm it, that the table was still there, waiting. I returned to the hallway again, the place that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of the restaurant, where the rules were written and the hum in the walls carried a different kind of resonance. "They're real," I said quietly, my voice echoing slightly in the narrow space, as if the walls themselves were listening. All of them. My eyes moved to the third line, the letters steady, unchanged, despite everything that had just happened. "Do not take the Seraphim's order." I didn't, I whispered, a strange sense of relief mixing with something else, something harder to define. And it listened. The thought lingered, unsettling in a way that went beyond fear because it suggested something I had not considered before, that not everything here was part of the system, that some things existed alongside it, or above it. I leaned closer, studying the surface of the skin the rules were written on, half expecting it to react, to acknowledge what I had experienced. It did not. It remained still, silent, but the hum in the walls grew slightly louder, resonating through my chest in a way that felt almost like approval or warning. I thought about authority then, about the structure of power, about the way systems are built and maintained, because back when I wore the badge, I had believed that I understood how it worked, who answered to whom, where the lines were drawn. But here, the lines blurred. The devil ran the kitchen, that much was clear. The rules governed the servers, that was also clear. But the Seraphim, it did not fit. It did not belong to the hierarchy I had started to map out in my head. It existed outside of it. And that meant there were layers here I had not yet seen, levels I had not yet reached, which raised a question I was not sure I wanted answered. If the devil was not at the top, then what was? When I returned to the floor, the table was gone. Not moved, not hidden, gone, as if it had never been there at all. But I knew better now than to trust what I could or could not see, because this place did not operate on visibility, and absence did not mean non-existence. It meant something else, something I would learn, eventually, whether I wanted to or not. The fourth rule did not arrive as something new that I needed to learn, but instead revealed itself slowly through the accumulation of experience, through the growing awareness that there had never been a pause, never a moment where the rhythm of the restaurant allowed for stillness. And as that realization settled into me, I understood that what I had taken for endurance was actually enforcement, something built into the structure of the place itself rather than a condition I could resist or overcome. I tried to trace back to the last time I had stopped moving, the last time I had allowed myself even a brief interruption in the cycle of orders, deliveries, and resets. But the memory would not form, because there had been no such moment since I arrived. Only the continuous flow of action layered on top of action until the distinction between beginning and continuation ceased to exist. Work 24/7, no breaks. The words did not introduce a new demand, but instead clarified the one I had already been living under, transforming something implicit into something absolute, and in doing so, they removed any illusion that what I was experiencing was temporary or adjustable. The weight of that understanding settled into me during service, not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual tightening, a pressure that built as I carried a tray across the dining floor, each step requiring more focus than the last as my arms trembled under a strain that no longer came from a single task, but from the accumulation of every task that had come before it without interruption. The plates shifted slightly as I moved, their contents reacting in subtle, unnatural ways that demanded constant adjustment, and I found myself compensating instinctively, maintaining balance not because I had the energy to spare, but because failure was not an option the system would tolerate. Behind me, the devil's voice emerged with its usual calm precision, not raised, not urgent, but carrying an awareness that cut through everything else. "You're slowing," he observed, and though the statement was simple, it carried the weight of something being recorded rather than judged, as if my performance existed as part of a larger calculation. "I'm maintaining," I replied, forcing steadiness into my voice despite the strain that threatened to expose itself, because admitting weakness here felt like opening a door that could not be closed once breached. He allowed a faint smile to form, the expression controlled, measured, and entirely devoid of warmth. They all believe that distinction matters, he said, his tone suggesting that whatever difference I thought existed between slowing and maintaining was irrelevant in the context of the system we were operating within. The work continued without interruption, the sequence repeating with such consistency that it ceased to feel like a series of actions and instead became a single, extended motion, a continuous process that carried me forward without offering any point of rest or reflection. Orders flowed in, dishes were prepared, trays were lifted, tables were served, and each completed task immediately gave way to the next, leaving no space for completion to register as anything other than transition. At some point, driven by something that felt more like instinct than decision, I attempted to create a pause, a brief moment of stillness that would allow me to step outside the rhythm, even if only for a second, and I did so carefully, positioning myself near the edge of the dining room where attention was less concentrated. I allowed my hands to fall to my sides, the tray momentarily absent, and I closed my eyes, intending to take a single breath that was not tied to movement, a breath that belonged to me rather than the system. The response was immediate and unmistakable, not violent but precise, as the floor beneath me shifted just enough to disrupt my balance, forcing my body to react and re-engage with motion in order to remain upright, as if the environment itself rejected the concept of stillness. "Keep moving," the devil's voice said, now close enough that I could feel the presence behind the words, though I hadn't seen him approach, and the instruction carried a finality that left no room for interpretation. I opened my eyes, the unfinished breath dissolving into the ongoing rhythm, and nodded, because understanding did not grant exemption, and awareness did not alter enforcement. As the cycles continued, I began to observe the other servers more closely, not as part of the background, but as indicators of what the rule truly meant when taken to its conclusion, and what I saw unsettled me in a way that went beyond fatigue or strain. They moved with precision, with consistency, with flawless adherence to the patterns of service, but there was something absent in their movements, something that had once been present and had since been worn away through continuous operation without interruption. When I attempted to engage one of them, stepping into his path just enough to force an interaction, his response, or lack of it, confirmed what I had begun to suspect, because he adjusted his trajectory with perfect efficiency, avoiding collision without acknowledging my presence, his gaze fixed forward as if deviation itself had been removed from his range of possible actions. I asked him if he ever felt tired, phrasing the question carefully, searching for any sign of recognition, any indication that the concept still existed for him, but the absence of response was complete. Not dismissive or intentional, but structural, as if the capacity to process the question had been eroded over time. I returned to the hallway again, drawn by the need to anchor myself in something that still felt definable, even if that definition came from rules written on something that should not exist. And as I stood before the list, the hum in the walls resonating through me, I spoke quietly, as if the act of articulation could preserve what I was beginning to lose. "They don't stop," I murmured, my voice barely carrying beyond the space immediately around me. "And it isn't because they can't, but because the system has removed the part of them that would choose to." My eyes fixed on the fourth line, the letters steady and unchanging despite everything that had shifted within me. "Work 24/7, no breaks. It isn't exhaustion," I continued, my thoughts aligning as I gave them form. "It's continuity, enforced to the point where interruption becomes impossible, and over time, that continuity replaces awareness. From that moment on, I no longer attempted to stop, not because I lacked the desire, but because I understood the consequence, not as punishment, but as transformation. A gradual erosion of the self that occurred when the system operated without interruption long enough to overwrite the structures that allowed for reflection, hesitation, and choice. Each movement became an act of preservation rather than compliance, because as long as I remained aware of the rule, as long as I understood what it was doing, I retained some measure of separation from it, even while existing within its boundaries. I thought back to the life I had lived before this place, to the long shifts that had once felt like proof of dedication, to the nights where I had pushed past exhaustion under the belief that persistence equated to purpose, and I began to see those moments differently, not as isolated decisions, but as part of a pattern that had conditioned me to accept continuous operation as something admirable rather than dangerous. There had been times when I should have stopped, when stepping back would have preserved clarity, when rest would have allowed for better judgment, but I had chosen to continue, to push forward, to maintain the rhythm because it felt necessary, because it felt justified. Standing in a place where that logic had been taken to its extreme, where the absence of breaks was no longer a choice but a rule, I understood the end point of that mindset, and it was not strength, not resilience, but erasure. The realization did not free me from the rule, nor did it provide a way to alter it, because understanding in this place did not equate to control, but it did change the way I experienced it. Because I could now see the mechanism at work, feel the way it pressed against the edges of my awareness, attempting to smooth them down, to remove the friction that allowed for thought. I continued to move, to serve, to carry, to reset, because there was no alternative. But beneath that motion, something remained intact, something that recognized what was happening and resisted being absorbed entirely into the process. And as long as that recognition persisted, as long as I could still name the rule and understand its function, I knew that I had not yet become what the others had become, even if I stood on the same floor, carried the same trays, and followed the same endless rhythm. The fifth rule did not arrive as a sudden revelation because by the time I understood it, I had already been working toward it through repetition, through accumulation, through the quiet and constant act of collecting something I had not realized I was measuring. And it was only when a particular tip settled into my hand with a weight that felt complete that the pattern aligned inside my mind and revealed its meaning. Collect a total of $1 million tip to go to heaven. The words locked into place with a clarity that felt deliberate, transforming the endless cycle of work into something with direction. Because for the first time, there was an end point, a measurable condition that could be fulfilled, even if everything else about the restaurant remained unchanged. From that moment on, every action carried intention layered beneath routine, because each table became part of a calculation, each interaction a potential contribution to the total, and I refined my movements with quiet precision, identifying patterns in behavior and adjusting my flow through the restaurant to maximize what I collected without breaking the rules that governed everything. The rhythm remained the same: orders, delivery, clearing, resetting, but now it carried weight beyond repetition, because each completed cycle moved me closer to something that existed beyond the system I was trapped in. I began to feel the total not as a number, but as pressure building behind my awareness, something that grew heavier with each addition. And when I asked the devil how much remained, his answer came without hesitation, carrying the same calm certainty that defined everything he said. "You'll know when it matters," he replied, and the finality of that statement told me that the moment would not need explanation when it arrived. As the total grew closer to completion, the presence of the seraphim returned, not immediately visible but perceptible in the atmosphere, a quiet awareness that stood apart from the decay of the restaurant, as if something beyond the system was observing the process as it approached its conclusion. The work intensified through my own adaptation, because I moved with greater efficiency, reduced hesitation, and focused entirely on maintaining the balance between compliance and optimization, allowing the accumulation to continue without disruption while the sense of completion drew closer with each passing cycle. The moment it happened did not announce itself with sound or spectacle, but with a quiet internal shift, as if something had locked into place. And as that realization settled into me, the restaurant seemed to clarify, not changing its form, but revealing an additional layer of perception, where the decay remained but was now illuminated by a faint, steady light. At the center of that clarity, the table appeared again, and the seraphim sat waiting, its presence steady and unchanged. "You have reached the threshold," the voice said, resonating through everything at once. "Your total is sufficient." I stepped forward, drawn by something that felt inevitable rather than chosen, and as I approached, the meaning of the moment settled into me with increasing weight. "I can leave," I said, the words forming slowly as the possibility became real. "Yes," the seraphim replied, its tone unwavering. "Heaven is available to you." The word carried weight, not just as a destination but as an answer to something I had not yet fully asked. The memories returned in full, not as fragments but as a complete structure, showing me the life I had lived before this place, the choices I had made, and the ways I had justified them. And I saw clearly how I had used authority not only to enforce rules, but to bend them when it suited me, causing harm I had chosen not to fully acknowledge at the time. "I was doing my job," I said, though the words felt insufficient even as I spoke them. "Yes," the seraphim replied, acknowledging the truth without altering its weight. "You are not being judged for your labor," the voice continued. "You are being judged for your life." And the distinction settled into me with a clarity that reframed everything, separating what I had done here from what I had done before. "You have met the condition, and you may enter." The phrasing lingered because it offered permission without offering absolution. I considered what was being offered, not as escape, but as transition. And as I did, I understood that leaving would not resolve what I had done, nor would it balance anything that remained unaddressed. "I don't think I should go," I said, the decision forming with a certainty that felt grounded rather than reactive. "I followed rules in my life," I continued, "but I also twisted them when it benefited me, and people paid for that in ways I chose not to fully see, which means leaving now would only remove me from the consequence rather than engage with it." I looked back at the restaurant, at the endless motion, at the servers who still moved within the system without awareness, and I recognized something that remained within my reach. "I cannot undo what I did," I said, "but I can choose what I do now. And that means staying, not to fix this place, but to guide those who still have enough awareness left to be guided." The seraphim remained still for a moment before responding, its tone unchanged but carrying a sense of final acknowledgement. "Very well," it said, and with that, the light receded slightly, allowing the restaurant to return to prominence without removing the clarity that had been introduced. "You will remain, but your role will change." When I turned back, the restaurant appeared the same, but my position within it had shifted, because I was no longer bound to the immediate cycle in the same way. And as I looked at the servers, I could see the moments where awareness still flickered beneath the surface of routine. The devil glanced at me from the kitchen, his expression steady as always, though his gaze held a sharper recognition. "Promotion," he said lightly. "Something like that," I replied, understanding that the label mattered less than the function. I took my place within the system, not outside it, but no longer consumed by it. And as the work continued around me, I began to guide where I could, preserving what remained of awareness in those who had not yet been fully absorbed into the endless rhythm. And for the first time since I arrived, the work was no longer something I endured, but something I chose.
Hi guys, Midnight Employee here. So I'm just clocking out of my work, and I also just finished editing the video that should be released last Saturday, but due to constant editing of the script and editing the video itself, it took much more time than I expected. That's why I am only releasing the video today. I just want to show you the full work that I've done in the editing software. So here it is. So it is not yet finished. I'm just going to add some sound effects and then maybe some transition, and then I will upload it. And here's the script that I am editing for the past few days, so as you can see, that's 30 pages with 8,000 plus words. But yeah, it is now done, and I thank you for supporting me. Bye.